The Zags have 9 players who are expected to be in the rotation this season, but we know that's not Mark Few's style, which means something's going to have to give.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Monday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, download the Gametime app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Folks, it is Mailbag Monday today. As a reminder, if you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, the easiest way to do so is to join our Discord channel. There is a link in the show notes, whether you are on an audio platform, whether you are on YouTube. You can find the link in there. It's free to join. About 350 of us right now hanging out. We got fantasy football leagues. We got prizes. We got all sorts of fantastic stuff going on in that Discord channel. There's also a spot for you to ask your mailbag questions. You can also email me at andypatton013@gmail.com to make sure your questions get answered. We try to do these every Monday, especially in the off season. Not as often in the season, but we try to get to them as much as we can. All right, a lot of great questions to get to today, so let's get right into it. This first question comes from Larry via Gmail. Larry says, pretty much every college coach has an established player rotation, usually 7 or 8 players. Mark Few is one of the coaches that leans towards 7, and now he has 9 players who could be or should be getting rotation minutes. I don't recall in the last 10 or 12 years he's ever had and used a 9-man rotation. The easy answer is that rotation minutes will change from game to game, dictated by how to attack and defend the particular opponent. My question, can or will Mark Few adapt to changing rotation minutes game to game? No, I think is the likeliest outcome here is that Mark Few is not going to dramatically alter his rotation on a game-by-game basis. Subtle adjustments will, of course, happen. They have to happen. There are different factors in every single game, whether it's foul trouble, whether it's fatigue issues, illness, ineffectiveness, dictated by matchups, various different things go into every single game that dictate, there are no games where every player plays the exact same amount of minutes every single game. Sometimes it's very close. Sometimes it is very, Mark Few is pretty stringent about the rotation, and you can kind of predict based on opponents, the quality of opponent in particular, which games you're going to see that rotation squeeze down to 7 or at times in the past 6 players, and which games maybe it's going to be 9, 10, 11. Maybe you see basically everybody on the roster play in certain games against certain opponents. But what we haven't really ever seen Mark Few do, from my recollection, is to dramatically alter like substitution patterns, like these players are going to come in earlier in the game, these players aren't going to come in at all, like dramatic swings game by game based on like this team's a inferior perimeter defender, so they don't have as good of a defense, so we're going to play Steel Venters as opposed to Dusty Stromer because we want more floor spacing. Like, I can understand the thought process behind that, and Steele and Dusty is probably a good example of players that could fluctuate. Like Steele might make more sense in this game because, again, he offers more floor spacing, and we're not as concerned about maybe his defensive deficiencies. Whereas this game, we'd rather have Dusty in there because he's a better perimeter defender, and we're not as concerned about the 3-point shooting. Like, that makes sense to me, but we haven't really ever seen Mark Few operate that way. And I don't think we're going to. And I think part of it is having players not be prepared for what their role is going to look like coming into every single game is a challenge. And the professionals, you can kind of get away with that a little bit more. They're getting paid every single day. That is their entire job, their entire life. If you have a player in college, they're younger, they're less mature. It's more difficult to suddenly be like, hey, you're playing big minutes today. In theory, they should be ready, but it's not always that simple. And I think for Mark Few and for a lot of college coaches, they have a tight rotation because that's how far deep they feel they can go and still compete in every game. And they want to keep those players kind of knowing, hey, I'm going to play this amount of minutes today. I'm going to get my opportunities. I'm not going to get yanked as soon as I struggle, things like that. So yeah, the lineup's going to change based on, again, early foul trouble for Graham Ike is going to play Braden Huffmore. That could allow, certain lineups to be a little bit different. If Caleb Battle gets in foul trouble, that's going to create more playing time for Dusty or Steele or whatever. Like, there's circumstances that are going to change game by game. But I think by and large, Mark Few is going to have the same game plan in terms of playing time and minutes distribution and substitution patterns pretty much every single night. Next question here comes from Adam via Gmail. Adam says, I know we all hope Mark Few is around for another 20 years, but hypothetically, if he decided to hang him up this year, who would be his ideal successor? Is it somebody already on the bench like Brian Michelson, somebody nationally who can run the up-tempo offense GU has nearly perfected, or somebody ingrained in the program like Adam Morrison? He's coached his daughter's AAU team, so I know it's a bit of a stretch. He also says, does Tommy Lloyd want to get out of the desert? Well, when you say, does he hang him up right now? I think it's, let's pretend we're talking at the end of the season, because obviously if you were to hang him up right now in mid-July, the team's just going with an internal option. They're not conducting a national search in the middle of the offseason when most coaches are already very well established where they're at. So if we're talking at the end of the season, Mark Few, or he even announces during the season, hey, this is going to be my last year, my final hurrah, I'm hanging him up after this, which I want to be clear, I don't think is likely. I don't think Adam here thinks it's likely either, but in that scenario, what would Gonzaga do? It is pretty well established within the program that the plan for the successor of Mark Few is an internal hire. In this case, on the current, as the coaching staff is currently constructed, it would be Brian Michelson. I would be very surprised if in the next calendar year, if Mark Few is not the head coach of the Gonzaga Bulldogs, if it's anybody other than Brian Michelson. You may disagree with that as the plan, but I would be very surprised if it's not the plan. Obviously, Tommy Lloyd would be great. And had the timing worked out where Mark Few left when Tommy Lloyd wanted to take over when he was still in the program, that would have been fantastic. But if Mark Few hangs on for 5, 8, 10 more years, which is very possible, Brian Michelson will have had the same amount of experience in Gonzaga's coaching staff as Tommy Lloyd did. That doesn't mean he's going to be as good of a coach necessarily, but he will have been at that level. Right now, he's not. He hasn't been in that associate head coach role for as long because Tommy only left a few years ago. Tommy would be the dream choice. Nobody's debating that. Brian Michelson is the likely outcome. I'll toss Leon Rice out there. I've mentioned Leon Rice a handful of times whenever this question comes up in Mailbag. Leon Rice spent about a decade coaching at Gonzaga. He's worked with Mark Few for a very long time. He worked with Tommy Lloyd for a very long time. He's been at Boise State as a head coach for a very long time now as well, and he's had a ton of success. Leon has not had the NCAA tournament success, and I know that would scare people. And he does not run a similar style. Gonzaga's style would change under Coach Leon Rice. That would be a bit of an adjustment. He's a more defensive-focused coach. They play a bit more grinded-out style than Mark Few in the high up-tempo offense and Tommy Lloyd's offense as well at Arizona. But I would toss Leon Rice out there because I think he would be an incredibly strong candidate based on his connections to Gonzaga, his familiarity with the landscape, the location, just the atmosphere. Like, you have to know what you're getting into at Gonzaga. He knows that, and he's already been a long-time established head coach. There are very few people who check all of those boxes that aren't Tommy Lloyd, and Leon Rice is certainly one of them. There are other options that could crop up down the line who are current coaches and either former players or affiliated with the program, like John Jacuz, who's at Florida Atlantic, and he's about to start his first year as a head coach. Stephen Gentry, of course, who's on the staff. Roger Powell, who was on the staff, who's now at Valparaiso. Gary Bell, who's at Northern Arizona as an assistant coach. Like Rem Backamus, there are options, but they're not ready yet. So if we're talking this year, it's B-Mike. If we're talking down the line, who knows? Maybe some other options will crop up. Next question here comes from Kelly V on Instagram, who says, I saw Killian Tilly is playing in the Summer League. Does he have a chance to make an NBA roster this year? In fact, how likely are all the Summer League Zags to be in the NBA this season? All right, we got 4 of them. Let's go through them. Julian Strother, lock. Easy peasy. He is a lock. He scored 25 points in his first Summer League game with the Denver Nuggets. He is going to be a member of the Denver Nuggets this season, hopefully a consistent part of their rotation, but if nothing else, he will be on that roster. Anton Watson, 8 points on 4 of 7 shooting in his first game with the Boston Celtics. I think he's pretty likely to be a two-way guy, which means he will get NBA opportunities. I believe with a lot of confidence that Anton Watson will play his first NBA game this upcoming season, although I'm not as confident that he will be somebody who sticks on the roster for the duration of the season. Next up, Killian Tilly had 4 points in his first game, again, also with the Boston Celtics, 1 of 5 from the field, 2 of 2 from the free throw line. It's a tougher path for him, but he has played 54 NBA games, and he has proven he belongs on an NBA basketball court. That alone gives him a massive leg up over other players who are in the Summer League who have yet to play an NBA game. Killian Tilly has missed 2 years with various injuries. That is going to be a huge hurdle. But if he proves he is healthy, he doesn't have to be excellent. He has to prove that he's healthy and looks good. He's moving laterally well. His mobility doesn't look impacted by his injuries. If he can do that, in summer league, even if the shots are maybe maybe it's not as at the level he'd want it to be. I think that still gives him a very good opportunity to sign a contract, go into training camp, maybe give a two-way deal, or at least be like somebody who plays in the NBA at some point this season. Last but not least, Drew Timme. Drew had a double-double for the Kings in his first game with them in Summer League. He is now permanently staying with Sacramento. He kind of flirted with Toronto for a little bit. It was weird. Summer League contracts are a little bit kind of all over the place, but he's with Sacramento now. He struggled in his second game, had a lot of turnovers, just didn't shoot the ball all that well. I think it's pretty unlikely, unfortunately, that Drew starts the season in the NBA. He didn't last year. He was straight into the G League, didn't have a two-way contract. I think that's what happens this year, whether it's with Sacramento, whether it's with somebody else, I'm not sure. I wouldn't be stunned if Drew plays in the NBA this year. I would be very excited and happy for him. I hope that he does. But I think it's him and Tilly have a harder path to being actual NBA players this year. Certainly not for the long term, but I think it's possible both of them will at least make their NBA day. Or I guess it wouldn't be Tilly's debut, but I think there's a real chance Timme does make his debut at some point this season. Speaking of Drew Timme, we're going to discuss his basketball future as well as some scheduling conversations and more, all coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, and patience, that's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts to choose from for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back because, folks, with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Eddie Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, we're still going through Mailbag Monday here as we are in the midst of the offseason, the middle of July, pre-Olympics, and just in the start of Summer League. So a lot of exciting stuff happening in Zag Nation. Next question here comes from Adam via Gmail. Adam says, as much as I'd love to see Drew Timme make it in the NBA, but with what the current outlook is, do you think his skill set would translate into college coaching as he was so dominant in the college game? For example, Shem Karnowski at Arizona. Yeah, Shem's been a grad assistant for the last couple of years at Arizona. Hasn't really stepped into a full coaching job yet, unless I'm mistaken about that. But obviously taking a similar path to like what Zach Norvell did at Gonzaga as a graduate assistant. We've seen other former Zags come back to the program. JP Bautista just recently did that as well. I get this question a lot, not just about Drew Timme, but about various players. And the answer is ultimately really, I don't know. Like if I don't know the player personally, it's really hard to know. And I think the fallacy of the better as you were as a player, the better you are as a coach is not true. In fact, it's been pretty demonstrably proven to be the opposite in many situations where players who thrived don't become very good coaches, whereas players who scraped by as professionals end up being the best coaches. In Major League Baseball, backup catchers are the guys you think are going to be great managers someday. Sometimes it's starting catchers, but it is usually not superstars who become managers at the Major League Baseball level. In the NBA, the best coach in the NBA right now is Steve Kerr. He was a good NBA basketball player. He was not an elite basketball player. Eric Spoelstra didn't play in the NBA. The head coach for the Miami Heat, Tyronn Lue, was a fine NBA player, but he was not elite by any stretch. I think it's, and then you look at some of the great players who have coached college or NBA. Penny Hardaway has been average. Jerry Stackhouse was not very good as a head coach at Vanderbilt. Like you see guys not necessarily become elite coaches after being very, very good players. Drew seems to have the personality that would work well as a coach. He's fiery, he's intense, he's obviously got an incredibly high basketball IQ, but in terms of actually teaching and learning how to do that, how to bring that side of it, talk to the media, do all the other aspects of coaching, recruiting, all that stuff. There are so many factors that go into being a college basketball head coach. And I have no idea Drew's capacity to handle that, his desire to handle that. It's a really tough industry. And it's not an industry where I can look at a person who I haven't met and talked to extensively to really know whether they would be able to handle it or, of course, whether they would want to. Does it seem like Drew would be a super fun head coach? Absolutely. but I can't say a whole lot more about it than that. Next couple questions here both come from Jeff via Gmail regarding scheduling. Jeff says, now that Washington State is back on Gonzaga's schedule, in your opinion, other than Washington and Arizona, what is the team or two that you most want to see Gonzaga play that they used to play? Is there a team that Gonzaga has never played or not played in several decades that you would like to see Gonzaga play? Yeah, I think Arizona is the obvious answer. I know you said excluding them, so I won't spend much more time on that, although that would clearly be the game that the majority of people would want to see more consistently. I'm going to say Creighton. Gonzaga and Creighton have played before. They've played in NCAA tournaments before. They've played non-conference matchups before, neutral sites, I believe. They've done a home-and-home as well. There's history between the two programs in terms of NCAA games, in terms of regular season matchups, in terms of two key transfers. Grant Gibbs going from Gonzaga to Creighton about 12, 15 years ago. And then Ryan Nembhard, of course, much more recently coming from Creighton to Gonzaga. They're two Jesuit Catholic institutions. They're two consistently excellent college basketball programs. They're two programs that have had coaches who have been there for a very long time and have had sustained, consistent success. That to me feels like a very easy slam dunk. Put them on the schedule. Let's get that thing going. I know they're not playing right now, likely until Ryan is fully out at Gonzaga, and I don't blame them for that, but I would like to see that game get back on the calendar going forward. There's some other obvious choices. Baylor makes sense. That's a fun one. Duke makes sense because it's Duke. It's always fun. North Carolina, same thing. But I think if I had to pick one, Creighton would be the pick there. Next question again from Jeff via Gmail. He says, in the early 2000s, Gonzaga played St. Joe's 5 years in a row when they had Jameer Nelson and Delonte West on the team. Is there a mid-major team like St. Joe's that has those types of players that could make a really exciting series with Gonzaga? San Diego State would be the easy answer here, but since Gonzaga has been regularly playing them, what other mid-major program do you want to see Gonzaga play a series against? Is the home-and-home series that Gonzaga had with St. Joe's 20 years ago a thing of the past now that Gonzaga has become a major power in college basketball? Yes, it's a thing of the past for a couple of reasons. Gonzaga becoming a powerhouse is absolutely part of it. The fact that they can schedule games like UCLA and Kentucky and UConn in the same season. I mean, if you told the people who were around when Gonzaga scheduled St. Joe's 5 years in a row, if you told them, hey, 15 years from now, 18 years from now, whatever it is, you're going to be able to play Kentucky, UCLA, and Kentucky, UConn, and UCLA in the same year. People will be like, well, yeah, like, of course, we would rather do that than play St. Joe's. You know, like, that's no disrespect to St. Joe's. It's just like people didn't expect Gonzaga to get to the level where they could play these types of opponents every single year. And it's kind of barely even on the radar at this point. We're just kind of used to seeing those types of games crop up for the Zags. But beyond just that, Gonzaga's non-conference schedule is getting squeezed. We know this. Mark Few is quite unhappy about this. He's talked about this to the press already. The fact that the conference is adding Oregon State and Washington State squeezes them out of games. Next year, they're going to add Grand Canyon and Seattle U. We don't exactly know what the conference slate might look like, but it's possible it's squeezed again for Mark Few and the Zags. They don't have as many opportunities, and they're going to prioritize the marquee games that they need on the calendar to pick up the big wins. You want those UConns, those Kentuckys, those UCLAs. You want the MTE. Gonzaga is going to continue to do MTEs year after year. So 3 games go to the MTE. You get a handful of super marquee games, and then you have to have your bye games. I know people get frustrated every time Gonzaga schedules a game against somebody that they don't want to play or some school they've never heard of, but those are vital. They're vital to your schedule in terms of getting to have tune-up games and experiment with rotations and lineups and try new things. They're vital because you need to just blast the doors off bad teams in order to improve your net ranking. It is a flaw in the system that we'll talk more about later this week as the NCAA has tried to add some metrics to potentially help curb some of that. But ultimately, Gonzaga wants a few teams that they're just going to blast. They want a few really, really good teams that they win or lose are still going to help them in terms of their net and all that stuff. They got an MTE. And then after that, you just don't have as many opportunities left. You just only have a few games. We see Gonzaga play a good mid-major pretty much once a year. Yale, Kent State, those are 2 recent examples. They've obviously had other good examples as well, but they just don't have a lot of room to play multiple of those types of teams. In terms of teams that would qualify in this conversation, McNeese is a pretty good example, but they haven't been consistently good, and I think their success kind of lasts as long as Will Wade is the head coach there. Dayton is a more successful, consistently year-over-year program in a mid-major level. They just lost to Ron Holmes. He was their best player for 3 or 4 years, so we'll see how they kind of bounce back from that. There's some San Diego State teams in the Mountain West, Boise State, except that they won't ever play because Leon Rice and Mark Few are close friends. Nevada might make some sense, UNLV, programs like that. But I wouldn't, expect to see consistent mid-major opponents year over year on Gonzaga's schedule going forward. San Diego State is kind of a counterexample, like you said, but I don't think this is going to be a regular thing for the Zags, in part because of just the way that NCAA tournament seeding is determined, and just the lack of as many non-conference games as Gonzaga would like to have. Well, folks, we're going to close out the show talking about if Gonzaga were its own Olympic team, the country of Gonzaga University, what that would look like, what the roster would be. Would they compete to legitimately medal in the Paris Olympics here in a couple of weeks? We're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and it's still Mailbag Monday. And we got 3 more questions to close out the show, get you out, get you on for your day before we're back on Tuesday with more fun stuff here on the program. This question comes from Mark via Twitter DM. Mark says, if Gonzaga were one of the 12 countries in the Olympics, what would their 12-man roster be, and would they be good enough to medal? This is fun. I get questions a lot about, like, how would a Gonzaga team do in the NBA? And I feel in those situations like I'm kind of forced to pick players who are currently in the NBA. With this roster, I can pick anybody. I can pick anybody who's played at Gonzaga, put them on this roster. I'm assuming that if a player is on this roster, they are not on other rosters, which is relevant for the Canadian roster, and it is relevant for the Japan roster. So here's the 12-man roster that I have selected. There are a lot of other players who could have been picked for this. Some of you are going to be screaming that there are players that I left off. I understand that, but I tried to go with roster construction, understanding FIBA rules and international competition and what that has looked like, what the certain priorities that we've seen Team USA make in various other countries, and just general roster construction in terms of how it would work for these particular players. So this would be my projected starting 5. Chet Holmgren at the 5, Domantas Sabonis at the 4, Corey Kispert at the 3, Jalen Suggs at the 2, Andrew Nembhard at the 1. So you already got, obviously, Nembhard. It would be removed from Team Canada's roster. The Lithuanians did not qualify, but if they had, Domantas Sabonis would obviously be removed from that roster. Suggs was not on Team USA, but he did practice with the team this week. But that would be your starting 5 there. My backup 5 would be Kelly Olynyk at the 5, again, removing him from Team Canada's roster. Brandon Clark at the 4. He doesn't get to replace Kelly on Team Canada's roster, although he would be a candidate in real life in that situation. Rui Hachimura at the backup 3, again, removing him from Japan's roster. Julian Strother at the 2. Nigel Williams-Goss at the 1. I think when putting this roster together for Gonzaga players in the NBA and only using NBA players, the biggest area of concern for them is guard depth. There's not enough guards in the NBA from Gonzaga that pulling together a roster there would really function. But if you're just pulling from anywhere, Nigel Williams-Goss just has been fantastic. He's playing at the highest level in the EuroLeague. He's playing in Spain. He's been dominant over there. When he's healthy, he is incredible. And having him on this roster is a huge boost. It's a 12-man team, so you got your starting 5, your backup 5. Positionally, I think it all kind of works, but so I just wanted to add some positional versatility to round out the roster in Anton Watson. I think having a switchable big, somebody who can defend on the perimeter and defend around the basket, is vital. The Zags have that with Chet. They have that with Clark, but now they have it again with Anton Watson. And I wanted another point guard just to be safe, to feel secure in Gonzaga's guard depth on this country's roster. So give me Kevin Pangos. If he's healthy, he's not healthy right now, but if we're talking everybody's healthy, full strength, 100%, give me Kevin Pangos to round out this roster. How would they do? Well, they're not beating Team USA. It's not happening. We're not going to pretend that it would. It's not happening. But they can compete against every other country in the Olympics currently, in my mind. They can compete with a Canada roster that does not have Andrew Nembhard and that does not have Kelly Olynyk and does not replace them with Brandon Clark or Kevin Pangos, quite frankly. All 4 of those guys, if they're locked onto Gonzaga's roster, they're not on Team Canada's roster. If they replace Olynyk with Zach Edey, that's going to help them quite a bit. But I think this Gonzaga roster, with Chet and Sabonis in the front court, with Suggs and Nembhard in the backcourt, with quality depth options, can absolutely compete with Team Canada. I think they can compete with France, but they're going to have a hell of a time with Victor Wembanyama. Who isn't, quite frankly? That French team is good. They're deep. They have a lot of veterans. They're going to be tough. Does Gonzaga beat France? I think that's a wash. I'm not confident that they win that one. Serbia, similar conversation. I didn't take Filip Petrusev, so he's still on the Serbian roster, but the concern is not Petrusev. The concern is Nikola Jokic, Bogdan Bogdanovic. They have a lot of talent on that roster as well. I think the rest of the teams, I feel pretty good for Gonzaga. I think they beat Puerto Rico. I think they beat South Sudan. I think they beat Japan without Rui. But for me, it's U.S., France, Canada, Serbia, and Gonzaga are kind of would all be outside of US. The rest of those would all kind of be in that competition for silver, bronze. I think this team is probably like fourth best roster. So could they win a bronze? Absolutely they could. But I'm not sold that they're just automatically going to get it. I'll tell you what, I would love for Gonzaga University to be a country in the Olympics with this roster, because I would love to see how they can do competing in that type of competition. I think it'd be incredibly fun. Not going to happen, of course, but it would be incredibly fun. Oh, and last note, they beat the Australians. Take that, St. Mary's. They beat them. Jock Landale, Patty Mills, Matthew Dellavedova. They got 3 Gales on that team. They got some other talented players, but this Gonzaga team, don't worry. They take care of the Aussies. 2 more questions here to get through before we get you out and into the rest of your day. This question here comes from Jackie via Gmail. Jackie says, which WCC team has had the best and worst offseason, excluding the newbies? Okay, I'm going to say LMU for the best offseason. I like what LMU has done in the transfer portal. I like hiring Lorenzo Romar to be an assistant coach and a lead recruiter, because that is what he is really good at, and the actual in-game coaching, leave that to Stan Johnson. That is a big win for the Lions of LMU. It also brought them Javon Porter. Now, Javon Porter's got some legal issues right now. We'll see if that bleeds into the season. But if he is playing and if he is healthy, he's a really, really good player. He's an all WCC caliber player. So getting him to transfer from Pepperdine to LMU is a huge win for them. They get Myron Amy from San Jose State. He's fantastic, kind of an under-radar portal addition. Matar Diop from Nebraska is interesting as well. And the big fish for me is Jan Vide, coming from UCLA. We've seen players transfer down from high majors and succeed. It's happened twice at Santa Clara, in Brandon Pajemski from Illinois, and then Adama Alpha-Ball from Arizona. Now LMU is doing it with Jan Vide. I think this is really going to work. I think Jan Vide has a chance to be one of the best players in the WCC next season. Adding him and Javon Porter and some quality role pieces and a quality recruiter and assistant coach, that's a darn good offseason for Stan Johnson and the Lions, even if they lose Dom, even if they lose Justin Wright and Michael Graham and others. Really good offseason for them. In terms of worst, it's either Portland or Pepperdine, and I'm going to lean Pepperdine. Portland hasn't made a lot of additions in the offseason yet, but the few guys they have brought in I like. And while they've lost a ton of talent, their offseason is not done yet. So I'm curious to see how the rest of it goes. Pepperdine has lost so much talent. And while I like some of their additions, it's just not nearly enough. Pepperdine loses Javon Porter to LMU. They, of course, lose Michael Ajayi to Gonzaga. They lose Houston Millett to Alabama. They lose Malik Moore, Nils Cooper. Both those guys transfer. Ethan Anderson out of eligibility. Basically, all of their contributors last year are gone. And they've made some fine additions. Mo Odom was the best player at Pacific last year. Now he's at Pepperdine. That's a nice addition for them. He's going to be a good player in that system. Aaron Clark comes over from Wake Forest. Stefan Todorovic comes over from San Francisco. There's some okay players on this roster. But from a talent perspective, they are nowhere near as talented as they were last year. And I think that they have to be the crowned, at this point, the offseason's biggest loser in the WCC. Final question of the show comes from Pete_22909 on Discord, who says, do you agree with Mike Bianchi's sentiment as expressed in his recent article that the way young American players are being taught basketball is fundamentally flawed? He claims that this failure is demonstrated by the high percentage of Europeans picked in the first round of the most recent NBA draft, as well as the high quality of European players currently playing in the NBA. Yeah, I think judging an entire country's basketball developmental system based on the percentage of Europeans drafted out of 58 players in the most recent NBA draft is ludicrous. Do I think that the USA's development of prospects and of just general player development for basketball is flawed? Yes. So the answer to that specific question, yeah, it's flawed. It's not perfect. Do I think that the reason that we consider it flawed is because a couple of Europeans got drafted early in this draft? No, that to me is insane. Judging an entire country's developmental process based on the 58 players in the NBA draft, I mean, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense to me. There are millions of people who play basketball who are not in the United States. Yet the majority of players in the NBA are from the United States. The vast majority. The majority of players drafted this year came out of college basketball. There were more Europeans than usual, but the vast majority of people who play in the NBA, the highest league of basketball in the entire world, still come from the United States. A few more Europeans coming into the league, and yes, some of them are dominant. Obviously, Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Luka Doncic, like the list goes on and on. We know that, and I think that those countries developing high level talented players doesn't mean that the U.S. is broken or that their system isn't good. It just means that other countries are catching up, maybe even surpassing us in some ways. But I don't think that specifically should be used as an indictment on all of the youth systems in the United States. I just think that that's a really broad statement and kind of a fundamentally flawed way to approach journalism. You don't make sweeping generalizations about entire swaths of hundreds of millions of people based on something as small as 58 players in the NBA draft. It just doesn't work for me. It doesn't compute. Does it mean that the actual premise is wrong? No, not necessarily. I just don't like the way that it was gone about in this particular article. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We'll be back on Tuesday. Continue to keep you up to date on recruiting updates as we see them. Continue to keep you up to date on the Olympics as the teams get ready for that. Summer League updates coming your way. Women's basketball recruiting, Zags and the MLB. We got all sorts of fantastic stuff coming your way in the next couple of weeks here on Locked On Zags. Don't go anywhere. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so already, and join the Discord channel. Like I said, free to join. Link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. Until next time, as always, go Zags.